Chapter 26 of the Cornet of Horse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Mark Leader. The Cornet of Horse by G.A. Henty. Chapter 26. The Siege of Tournai. In a few minutes, they were alongside the lugger. "Maître Nicolet! Maître Nicolet!" the Marquis shouted. "Hola!" and ahead showed up the companion. On seeing who it was, the speaker emerged. "It's you, Maître Perrault." "Have you your cargo on board?" "Every barrel," said the skipper. "We sail tomorrow morning." "I will give you 250 louis if you will sail in 10 minutes, and as much more if you land us safely in England." "Really?" "Really." "It's a bargain." "Hola, Pierre! Etienne!" Two lads ran up from below. "Run to the wine shops on the quay. Fetch the crew. Just whisper in their ears. Say I'm casting off, that no man must wait to say goodbye to his wife, and that each down in 5 minutes will have as many louis, and that in 10 I sail, if with only half the crew. Run! Run!" The two boys set off at full speed. "I fear 10 minutes will be impossible, Maître Perrault. But all that can be done shall. Is 10 absolutely necessary?" 20 may do, Maître Nicolet, but if we are not off by that time, we shall not be able to go at all." "You are pursued?" "Yes. In half an hour at latest, a troop of soldiers will be here after us." Maître Nicolet looked at the sky. "There's wind enough when we once get well beyond the town, but unless we get a good start, they will overtake us in boats. Is it a state affair, Maître Perrault? For I own to you, I don't like running my head against the state." "I'll tell you frankly, Captain. I am the Marquis de Pignerol. This is my daughter. The king wants her to marry a man she does not like, and I'm running away with her to save her from being shut up in a convent till she agrees." "And this one?" Maître Nicolet said, pointing to Rupert. "That is the gentleman whom both I and my daughter like better than the king's choice." "That's all right," Maître Nicolet said. "There's no hanging matter in that. But look, sir, if you should be late, and they come up with us in boats or warn the forts at the entrance, mind, we cannot fight. You must send us all below with your swords and pistols, you see, and batten us down so that we shan't be responsible, else I could never show my face in a French port again. Ah, here come 4 of the men. Yes, and 2 more after them. That's good." "Now," he said, when the men came up, "not a question, not a word. There's money, but it has to be earned. Now set to work, loosen the sails, and get all ready for casting off." In a quarter of an hour from the moment the party had reached the Belgian, 8 men had arrived, and although these were but half the crew, the captain, who had been throwing himself heart and soul in the work, declared that he would wait for no more. The last rope was thrown off, and the lugger dropped out into the stream. It was running rapidly out, and as the wind caught the sails, the Belgian began to move, standing down towards the sea. During the time the lugger had been prepared for sea, the passengers had remained below, so as not to attract the attention of the little crowd of sailors whom the sudden departure had assembled on the quay. But they now came up on deck. Scarcely were they in the middle of the stream and the sails had fairly gathered way on her, when Rupert exclaimed, "There they are!" as a party of horsemen rode down on the quay, now nearly a quarter of a mile away. Then a faint shout came across the water, followed by a musket shot, the ball splashing in the water a little way astern. The men looked at each other and at their captain. "Look here, lads, I'll tell you the truth about this matter, and I know that, as men of La Vendée, you will agree with me. This gentleman who crossed with us before is a noble, and the king wants this lady, his daughter, to marry a man she does not like. The father agrees with her, and he and her fiancé, this gentleman here, have run away with her to prevent her from being locked up. Now we are bound as true Vendéans to assist them. And besides, they're going to pay handsomely. Each of you will get 10 louis if we land them safe in England. But you know we cannot resist the law, so we must let these gentlemen with their swords and pistols drive us below, do you see? And then we shan't be responsible if the Jean does not heave to when ordered. Now, let us make a bit of a scuffle, and will you fire a shot or two, gentlemen? They'll be watching us with glasses from the shore, and we'll see that we make a fight for it." The sailors entered into the spirit of the thing, and a mock fight took place. The Marquis and Rupert flashed their swords and fired their pistols, the crew being driven below, and the hatch put on above them. The fugitives had time to look around. 2 boats laden with soldiers had put out and were rowing after them. The Marquis took the helm. "The wind is freshening, and I think it will be a gale before morning, Rupert. But they're gaining upon us. I fear they will overtake us." "I don't think they will get on board if they do, sir," Rupert said. "Had not Adele better sit down on deck under shelter of the bulwarks? For they keep on firing, and a chance shot might hit her." "It's no more likely to hit me than Papa or you, Rupert." "No more likely, my dear," her father said, "but we must run the risk, and you need not. Besides, if we are anxious about you, we shall not be so well able to attend to what we have to do." Adele sat down by the bulwark, but presently said, "If they come up close, Papa, I might take the helm if you show me which way to hold it. I could do it sitting down on the deck, and you could help Rupert keep them off." "Your proposal is a very good one, Adele, and it pleases me much to see you so cool and steady." The bullets were now whistling past the lugger, sometimes striking her sails, sometimes with a sharp tap hitting her hull or mast. "We may as well sit down out of sight till the time comes for fighting, Rupert," the Marquis said. "Our standing up does no good, and only frightens this little girl." The firing ceased when they sat down, as it was clearly a waste of powder and ball continuing. Rupert from time to time looked over the stern. "The first boat is not more than 50 yards behind, the other 30 or 40 behind it. They gain on us very slowly, but I think they'll catch us." "Then we must do our best, Rupert. We have each our pistols, and I think we might begin to fire on the rowers." "The pistols are not much good at that distance, sir. My idea is to let them come alongside, then I will heave that cask of water down into the boat, and there will be an end of it." "That water cask," the Marquis said, "that's an 18-gallon cask. It's as much as we can lift it, much less heave it through the air." "I can do it, never fear," Rupert said. "You forget my exercises at Loche, and as a miller's man." "My only fear," he said in a low voice, "is that they may shoot me as I come to the side with it. For that reason, we had better begin to fire. I don't want to kill any of them, but just to draw their fire. Then just as they come alongside, put a cap and a cloak on that stick and raise them suddenly. Any who are still loaded are sure to fire the instant it appears." The Marquis nodded, and they began to fire over the stern, just raising their heads and instantly lowering them. The boats again began to fire heavily. Not a man in the boats was hit, for neither of those in the lugger took aim. The men cheered and rowed lustily, and soon the boat was within 10 yards of the lugger, coming up to board at the side. Rupert went to the water barrel and rolled it to the bulwarks at the point towards which the boat was making. The Marquis stopped behind the bulwarks, a few paces distant, with the dummy. "Now," Rupert said, stooping over the barrel as the boat made a dash at the side. The Marquis lifted the dummy, and 5 or 6 muskets were simultaneously discharged. Then a cry of amazement and horror arose as Rupert, with the barrel poised above his head, reared himself above the bulwarks. He bent back to gain impetus, and then hurled the barrel into the boat as she came within a yard of the side of the lugger. There was a wild shout, a crash of timber, and in an instant the shattered boat was level with the water, and the men were holding on, or swimming for their lives. A minute later the other boat was on the spot, and the men were at work picking up their comrades. By the time all were in, she was only an inch or 2 out of the water, and there was only room for 2 men to pull. And the last thing those on board the lugger saw of her in the gathering darkness, she was slowly making her way towards shore. Now that all immediate danger was at an end, the Marquis took the tiller, and Rupert lifted the hatchway. "The captain and 2 of the crew may come on deck if they promise to behave well," he said. There was a shout of laughter, and all the sailors pressed up, eager to know how the pursuit had been shaken off. When Rupert told them simply that he had tossed one of the water barrels into one of the boats and staved it, the men refused to believe him, and it was not until he took one of the carronades, weighing some 500 weight, from its carriage and lifted it above his head as if to hurl it overboard, that their doubts were changed into astonishment. "I suppose our danger is not over, Captain?" the Marquis asked. "No, we have the forts at the mouth of the river to pass, but we shall be there before it's light. They will send off a horseman when they get back to the town, but they will not be there for some time, and the wind is rising fast. I hope we shall be through before they get news of what has taken place. In any case, at the speed we shall be going through the water in another hour or 2, no rowboat could stop us. I think, Captain Nikolai, it would be as well for you to keep only as many men as you absolutely want on deck, so that you can say we only allowed 2 or 3 up, and kept watch over you with loaded pistols." "It would be better, perhaps," Maître Nicolet said. "There's sure to be a nice row about it, and it's always as well to have as few lies as possible to tell. Perhaps mademoiselle would like to go below. My cabin is ready for her, and I have told the boy to get supper for us all." The captain's prediction about the rising wind was correct, and in another hour the Belle Jeanne was tearing down the river at a rate of speed which, had the road from Nantes to the fort been so longer than by water, would have rendered the chance of any horseman arriving before it slight indeed. But the river was winding, and although they calculated that they had gained an hour and a half start, Captain Nikolai acknowledged that it would be a close thing. Long ere the forts were reached, Adele was fast asleep below, while her father and Rupert paced the deck anxiously. The night was not a dark one. The moon shone out at times, bright and clear between the hurrying clouds. "There are forts," Maître Nikolai said. "The prospect is hopeful, for I do not see a light." The hands were all ordered below as they neared the forts, Maître Nikolai himself taking the helm. All was dark and silent as they approached, and as La Belle Jeanne swept past them like a shadow, and all was still, a sigh of relief burst from the Marquis and Rupert. 5 minutes later the wind brought down the sound of a drum. A rocket soared into the air, and a minute or 2 later lights appeared in every embouchure of the forts on both sides. "It has been a near thing," the Marquis said. "We've only won by 5 minutes." 3 minutes later came a flash, followed by the roar of a gun, and almost at the same moment a shot struck the water 50 yards ahead of them on their beam. "We are nearly a mile away already," the captain said. "It's 50-1 against their crippling us by this light, though they may knock some holes in our sails and perhaps splinter our timbers a little." "Ah, just what I thought. Here come the chasse marée." And he pointed to 2 vessels which had lain close under the shadow of the forts and which were now hoisting sail. "It's lucky that they are in there instead of cruising outside as usual. I suppose they saw the gale coming and ran in for a quiet night." The forts were now hard at work, and the balls fell thickly around. 1 or 2 went through the sails, but none touched her hull or spars, and in another 10 minutes she was so far away that the forts ceased firing. By this time, however, the chasse marée were under full sail and were rapidly following in pursuit. La Belle Jeanne had, however, a start of fully a mile and a half. "How do those craft sail with yours?" Rupert asked. "In ordinary weather the Jeanne could beat them, though they are fast boats. But they are heavier than we are and can carry their sail longer. Besides, our being underhanded is against us. It'll be a close race, monsieur. It will be too rough when we are fairly out for them to use their guns. But the best thing that can happen for us is that there may be an English cruiser not far off. I must have the hands up and take in some sail. She'll go just as fast, for she is too much on to be doing her best now we are in the open sea. Now, gentlemen, I advise you to lie down for an hour or 2. I'll call you if they gain much upon us." It was morning before the voyagers awoke and made their way on deck. They looked round, but no sail was in sight, only an expanse of foaming sea and driving cloud. The captain was on deck. "I suspect they've given it up and run back," he said, "and no fools either. It's not weather for anyone to be out who has a choice in the matter. But the Jeanne is a good sea-boat, and has been out in worse weather than this. Not but that it is a big gale, but it's from the north, and the land shelters us a bit. If it keeps on like this, I shall lie to a few hours. The sea will be tremendous when we get beyond Ushant." For 3 days the gale blew furiously, and the Jeanne lay to. Then the storm broke, and the wind veered round to the south, and La Belle Jeanne flew along on her way towards England. It was at a point on the Hampshire coast, near Lymington, that she was to run her cargo, and on the 5th day after leaving the river she was within sight of land. They lowered their sails and lay a few miles off land until nightfall, and then ran in again. 2 lights on the shore, one above the other, told that the coast was clear, and the boats were quickly lowered. The Marquis, who had come well provided with gold to meet all emergencies, handed over to Maître Nicolai £50 over the sum agreed on, and in a few minutes the travellers set foot on shore. 6 days later, a post-chaise brought them to the door of Winthorpe Chase, where Madame Holiday and the Colonel stood on the steps to welcome Rupert's future wife. The very day after their return, Rupert mooted to the Marquis the subject of an early marriage. But the latter said at once, "I must first take a place for Adele to be married from. Mademoiselle Adele de Pignerol must not be married like the daughter of a little bourgeois. Moreover, Rupert, it's already near the end of the year. In 3 months you will be setting out to join your regiment again. It would be cruel to Adele for you to marry her before the war is over, or until you at any rate have done with soldiering. You tell me that you've gone through enough, and that the next campaign shall be your last. At any rate, you can obtain a year's leave after 9 years of campaigning. So be it. When you return at the end of next year's campaign, you shall find all ready, and I will answer for it that Adele will not keep you waiting. It is but a fortnight since you were affianced to each other. You can well wait the year. And so it was arranged, for Rupert himself saw that it would be cruel to expose Adele to the risk of being made a widow after a few weeks only of married life. The winter passed very quietly and happily. The Marquis was always talking of taking a house, but Adele joined her voice with those of the others in saying that it would be cruel indeed for him to take her away from the chase until it was time for Rupert to start for the war again. In the middle of March, he received orders to join his regiment, as large numbers of recruits had been sent out and every officer was required at his post. During the winter of 1708, Marlborough had labored strenuously to obtain a peace which would satisfy all parties. Louis offered great concessions, which the Duke urged strongly should be accepted. But the English and Dutch wanted terms so severe and humiliating that Louis would not accept them, and both sides prepared for a great final struggle. The King of France addressed an appeal to his people, telling them that he had offered to make the greatest possible sacrifices to obtain peace for them, but that the enemy demanded terms which would place France at their mercy. He therefore appealed to their patriotism to come forward to save the country. The people responded readily to the summons, and Marshal Villars took the field in the spring with 110,000 men, a force just equal to that of the Allies. The French had taken up a position of such extraordinary strength that it was hopeless for the Allies to attempt to attack. His left wing was covered by the stream of Roubaix, his center by the marsh of Cambrieux, his right by the canal between Douai and Lille, and this naturally strong position had been so strengthened by artificial inundations, ditches, abattis, and earthworks as to be practically impregnable. Marlborough and Eugene made, however, as if they would attack, and Villars called to him as many men as could be spared from the garrisons round. The Allies then, by a sudden night march, arrived before Tournai, and at once commenced its investment. Tournai was an immensely strong town, but its garrison was weak. The heavy artillery was brought up from Ghent, and on the 6th of July the approaches were commenced. And on the 29th of that month the governor, finding that the Allies were gradually winning fort after fort, and that Villars made no movement to relieve him, surrendered the town and retired into the citadel, which was then besieged. This was one of the most terrible sieges ever undertaken, for not only were the fortifications enormously strong, but beneath each bastion and outwork, and far extending beyond them, an immense number of galleries had been driven from mines. At all times, soldiers, even the bravest, have found it difficult to withstand the panic brought about by the explosion of mines, and by that underground warfare in which bravery and strength were alike unavailing, and where the bravest as well as the most cowardly were liable at any moment to be blown into the air or smothered underground. The dangers of this service, at all times great, were immensely aggravated by the extraordinary pains taken by those who had constructed the fortifications to prepare for subterranean warfare by the construction of galleries. The miners frequently met underground, breaking into each other's galleries. Sometimes the troops, mistaking friend for foe, fought with each other. Sometimes whole companies entered mines by mistake at the very moment that they were primed for explosion. They were often drowned, suffocated with smoke, or buried alive. Sometimes scores were blown into the air. It was not surprising that even the hearts of the Allied troops were appalled at the new and extraordinary dangers which they had to face at the siege of Tournai, and the bravest were indeed exposed to the greatest danger. The first to mount a breach, to effect a lodgment in an outwork, to enter a newly discovered mine, was sure to perish. First there was a low rumbling noise, then the earth heaved, and whole companies were scattered with a frightful explosion. On the 5th of August, a sally made by the besieged was bravely repulsed, and the besiegers, pressing closely upon them, effected a lodgment. But immediately a mine was sprung, and 150 men blown into the air. On the 20th, the besieged blew down a wall which overhung a sap, and 2 officers and 34 soldiers were killed. On the 23rd, a mine 60 feet long and 20 feet broad was discovered, just as a whole battalion of Hanoverian troops had taken up their place above it. All were congratulating themselves on the narrow escape, when a mine placed below that they had discovered exploded, burying all in the upper mine in the ruins. On the 25th, 300 men posted in a large mine which had been discovered were similarly destroyed by the explosion of another mine below it, and the same night 100 men posted in the ditch were killed by a wall being blown out upon them. In resisting the attack upon one side of the fortress only, 38 mines were sprung in 26 days, almost every one with fatal effect. It is no detriment to the courage of the troops to say that they shrank appalled before such sudden and terrible a mode of warfare. And Marlborough and Eugene in person visited the trenches and braved the dangers in order to encourage the men. At last, on the 3rd of September, the garrison, reduced to 3,000 men, surrendered and were permitted to march out with the honors of war and to return to France on the promise not to serve again. This siege cost the Allies 5,000 men. End of chapter 26.
Chapter 27 of the Cornet of Horse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Victoria Alice Bell. The Cornet of Horse by G. A. Henty. Chapter 27. Malplaquet and the End of the War. During all the time that the Allies had been employed upon the siege of Tournai, Marshal Villars had labored to form an impregnable line of entrenchments, barring all farther advance. Marlborough, however, a day or two previously to the fall of Tournai, sent off the Prince of Hesse, Cassel, who by a rapid and most masterly march fell upon the French lines, at a part where the French had no expectation of there being an enemy within 30 miles of them. No opposition was made, and the Prince marched rapidly to the plateau of Jemmapes, invested Mons on the French side. The rest of the army followed. The effect caused throughout France, and indeed through Europe, by the success of this masterly movement was immense, and it was evident that a great battle was at hand. Villars moved his army rapidly. A detachment of Eugen's troops were left to watch Mons, and the allied army, 93,000 strong, advanced to meet them, and on the night of the 7th, bivouacked in a line 3 miles long, and 5 from that occupied by the French. Marshal Villars had with him 95,000 men. The forces, therefore, were as nearly as possible equal, but the Allies had 105 guns against 80 of the French. The position taken up by Villars was of great natural strength, being a plateau interspersed with woods and intersected with streams, and elevated from 150 to 200 feet above the meadowland of Trouville, across which their assailants must pass. Malplaquet stood on this plateau. On the slopes from the plateau to the plain the woods were extremely thick, and the only access to the plateau for troops were 2 clearings cut through the woods, known as the Trois de Louvier and de la Noix. On the morning of the 8th, when the French definitely took up their position, Marlborough and Eugen were in favor of making an instant attack, before the French could add to the great natural strength of their position by entrenchments. The Dutch deputies, however, were altogether opposed to an assault on so formidable a front. Finally, a compromise was adopted. A compromise which, as is often the case, was the very worst course which could have been adopted. The army should neither fall back as the Dutch wished, nor attack at once as Marlborough desired. It was resolved not to abandon the siege of Mons, and to attack the enemy if they would not take the offensive, but to wait until St. Ghislain, which commanded a passage on the Haine, was taken. and until 26 battalions on the march from Tournai arrived. It was 2 days before these conditions were fulfilled, and Villars had used these 2 precious days in throwing up a series of immensely strong works. The heights he occupied formed a concave semicircle, enflating on all sides the little plain of Malplaquet. And this semicircle now bristled with redoubts, palisades, abattis, and stockades, while the 2 tourelles, or openings by which it was presumed that the allies would endeavor to force an entrance, were so enfilade by cross batteries as to be well nigh unassailable. Half the French army by turns had labored ceaselessly at works, during the 2 days which the cowardly follies of the Dutch deputies had given them, and the result was the works resembled rather the fortifications of a fortress than ordinary field works. Marlborough and Eugen had seen from hour to hour the progress of these formidable works, and resolved to mask their front attack by a strong demonstration on the enemy's rear. The troops coming up from Tournai under General Withers were not ordered to join the main army, but to cross the Haine at St. Ghislain and to attack the extreme left of the enemy. At the farm of La Folie, Baron Schulenberg was to attack the left flank of the entrenchments in the wood of Tasnier, with 40 of Eugen's battalions supported by as many cannon, while Count Lutum was to attack the right flank of the wood with 22 battalions. The rest of the army was to attack in the front, but it was from Eugen's attack in the wood of Tasnier that success was chiefly hoped. At 3 o'clock on the morning of the 11th, the men were got under arms. Divine service was performed at the head of each regiment, and then the troops marched to the posts assigned to them in the attack. Both armies were confident, the French enthusiastic. The Allies relied on their unbroken series of victories. Never once since the war had begun had they suffered defeat, and with Eugen as well as Marlborough with them. They felt confident of their power to carry a position which, even to the eye of the least instructed soldier, was yet formidable in the extreme. The French were confident in being commanded by their best and most popular generals, Villars and Boufflers. They were strong in the enthusiasm which the king's appeal had communicated to the whole nation, and they considered it absolutely impossible for any enemy to carry the wonderful series of works which they had erected. At 7:30 all was ready, and the fog which had hitherto hung over the low ground cleared up, and the 2 armies came into view of each other, and the artillery on both sides opened a heavy fire. The whole line advanced, but the left was halted for a while Count Lutum, with his 22 battalions formed in 3 lines, attacked the right of the wood of Tasnier, and Schulenberg, with whom was Eugen himself, attacked their left. Without firing a single shot, Schulenberg's men marched through the storm of grape, which swept them until within 20 paces of the entrenchments, when the musketry fire of the French troops was so terrible that the attacking columns recoiled 200 yards, where they were steadied and brought back to the charge by the heroic efforts of Eugen, who exposed himself in front of the line. While this conflict was raging, some Austrian battalions which had formed the extreme right of Schulenberg's corps, but had been unable to advance owing to a deep marsh, stole round and pierced into the northeastern angle of the wood of Tasnier, and were soon in conflict with the French. Lautum's division had, with immense bravery, crossed a deep morass under a tremendous fire, and stormed a portion of entrenchments. But Villars, who was directly in rear, led on a fresh brigade, who drove back the assailants. Marlborough then charged at the head of Duvergne's cavalry, and some of Lautum's battalion again forced their way in. Meanwhile, Withers was quietly making his way through the wood from La Folie, and had made considerable progress before the French could muster in force at this point. As this threatened the rear of his front position, Villars fell back from the entrenchments in front of the wood, and took up the second and far stronger position he had prepared on the high ground. On the left, an even more desperate fight had been raging. The Prince of Orange commanded here. The prince was full of courage and impetuosity. The troops under him were Dutch, or auxiliaries in the Dutch pay, among them a Scotch brigade under the Marquis of Tullibaren. The corps advanced in the most gallant manner, the Scotch and Dutch rivaling each other in bravery. 2 lines of the enemy's entrenchments were carried at the bayonet, and had there been a reserve at hand, the battle would have been won at this point. But the prince had thrown his whole force into the attack, and his 40 battalions were opposed by 70 French battalions, while the assailants were swept by the fire from the high ground. Tullibardin and General Spau were killed, and the assailants fighting with extraordinary obstinacy, with a loss of 3,000 killed and twice as many wounded. The French sallied out to attack them, but the Prince of Hesse-Cassel charged them with his cavalry, and drove them back into their works. The news of the terrible slaughter and repulse on the right brought Eugen and Marlborough from the centre and left, where all was going well. Reserves were brought up and the battle restored. News now came that Villars, alarmed at the progress made on his left by Withers, had withdrawn the Irish brigade and some other of his best troops from his centre, to drive back the allies' right. Eugen galloped off with all haste to lead the right and hurry them forward, while Marlborough directed Lord Orkney to attack the weakened French centre with all his strength, and ordered the cavalry to follow on the heels of the infantry. The fight on the right was fierce indeed, for here Villars and Eugen alike led their men. Both were wounded, Villars in the knee. He refused to leave the field, but insisted on being placed in a chair where he could see the battle and cheer on his men. The agony he suffered, however, and the great loss of blood weakened him so that at last he fainted, the command devolving on Marshal Boufflers. Eugen was wounded in the head. In vain his staff pressed him to retire in order that the wound might be dressed.
"If I am to die here,"
he said,
"of what use to dress the wounds? If I survive, it will be time enough in the evening."
So with the blood streaming over his shoulders, he kept his place at the head of his troops, who, animated by his example and heroism, rushed forward with such impetuosity that the works were carried. In the centre an even more decisive advantage had been gained. Lord Orkney made the attack with such vigour that the entrenchments, weakened by the forces which had been withdrawn, were carried, and the horse, following close behind, broke through the openings of the works, and spread themselves over the plateau, cutting down the fugitives. The guns in the works were wheeled round, and opened a tremendous fire on the dense masses of the French drawn up behind other parts of the entrenchments. Thrown into confusion by the fire, the French began to waver, and Marlborough gave the order for the great battery of 40 guns in the allied centre to advance. These advanced up the hill, passed through the entrenchments, and opened fire right and left upon the French. Although the French still strove gallantly, the battle was now virtually over. The centre was pierced, the right turned, and Boufflers prepared to cover the necessary retreat with his cavalry. With 2,000 picked horsemen of the Royal Horse Guards, he charged the allied cavalry when scattered and blown by their pursuit, and drove them back, but was himself repulsed by the fire of Orkney's infantry and fell back, leaving half his force dead on the plain. Again and again Boufflers brought up fresh cavalry and executed the most desperate charges to cover the retreat of his infantry, who were now falling back along the whole line, as the Prince of Orange, benefiting by the confusion, had now carried the entrenchments on the French left. Boufflers formed his infantry into 3 great masses and fell back in good order in the direction of Beauvais. Such was the victory of Malplaquet, a victory indeed, but one at such cost that a few more such successes would have been ruin. The Allies had gained the French position, had driven the enemy from the field, and had prevented the raising of the siege of Mons, the great object of the French. But beyond that their advantage was slight, for the enemy retired in good order and were ready to have fought again, if attacked on the following day. The Allies captured 14 guns and 25 standards. The French carried off 32 standards, principally Dutch. The French lost 14,000 men in killed and wounded. The Allies fully 20,000. The French historians have done full justice to the extraordinary bravery of the Allied troops. One of their officers wrote after the battle, "Eugen and Marlborough ought to be well satisfied with us on that day, since up to that time they had not met with a residence worthy of them. They may now say with justice that nothing can stand before them, and indeed what should be able to stay the rapid progress of those heroes? If an army of 100,000 men of the best troops, strongly posted between 2 woods, trebly entrenched, and performing their duty as well as any brave men could do, were not able to stop them one day, will you not then own with me that they surpass all the heroes of former ages?" The siege of Mons was now undertaken, and after a month's gallant defence, fell, and the 2 armies they went into winter quarters. There remaining now only the fortress of Valenciennes, between the Allies and Paris. Rupert Holiday was not present with the army at the siege of Mons. He had distinguished himself greatly in the desperate cavalry fight which took place upon the plateau after the British infantry had forced their way in, more than once fighting, in front of his regiment. He had been cut off and surrounded when the Allied cavalry gave way before the valiant charge of the French cavalry. But each time his strength, his weight, and the skill with which he wielded the long, heavy sword he carried, enabled him to cut his way through the enemy's ranks, and to join his regiment. He had not, however, come off scatheless, having received several severe sabre cuts. Hugh had also been wounded, and Rupert readily obtained leave to retire to England to be cured of his wounds, the Duke of Marlborough raising him to the rank of colonel on the field of battle. He had during the campaign received many letters from Adele, which told him that the Marquise had taken a house. But to each inquiry that Rupert made as to its locality, she either did not answer the question at all or returned evasive answers. All he knew was that she was staying at the Chase, and that the Marquise was away, seeing to the renovation of his house. It was not until Rupert returned that he obtained the clue to this little mystery. The Marquise de Pigneroles had bought the How, formerly the property of Sir William Brownlow, and intended the estate as a dowry for Adele. The Pigneroles estate was indeed very large, and 2 or 3 years of his savings were sufficient, not only to purchase the estate, but to add to and redecorate and refurnish the house. Madame Holiday handed over to Rupert the title deeds of the whole of the Winthrop estate owned by her, as the income from her savings was more than enough to maintain her at Winthrop Chase. One only condition the Marquise exacted with the dowry, which was that the combined estate should, after Rupert finally came into possession of the Chase, be known not as the How, but as Winthrop Chase. It was at Winthrop Chase, my dear Rupert, that you first knew and drew sword for Adele, and the name is dear to her as to you. It is only right that I should unite the 2 estates, since I prevent their union some 10 years ago. I am in treaty now for a small estate 2 miles on the other side of Derby, so that, until the king either forgives me or dies, I shall be near you. The wedding did not take place quite so soon as Rupert had hoped, for his wounds were more severe than he had at first been willing to allow, and it was not until the last week of the year that the wedding took place. For many years after the event the marriage of Rupert Holiday with Mademoiselle de Pigneroles was talked of as the most brilliant event which had taken place in the county of Derby during the memory of man. The great Duke of Marlborough himself and his Duchess came down to be present at the ceremony. From Holland came over Major Dillon, and 4 or 5 others of the officers of the 5th Dragoons. Lord Fairholme was also there, and Hugh was not the least welcome to Rupert of those assembled at the wedding. Hugh was still a private, for although he could long ere this have been a sergeant had he chosen, he had always refused promotion, as it would have removed him from service as Rupert's orderly. There was also present at the wedding a young Dutch lady engaged to be married to Major Dillon, and her father. Rupert had ridden over to say how glad he should be to see them at his marriage, but that he could not think of asking them to come so far. Mynheer van Duyck had written, however, to say that he and his daughter would certainly come, for that regarding Rupert as a son it would be extraordinary indeed for him to be absent. And so they arrived at the Chase 2 days before the wedding, and on the morning before going to church he presented Rupert with a cheque which simply astounded the young soldier. At first, indeed, he absolutely refused to accept it. The merchant, however, insisted so strongly upon it, urging that his own wealth was so large that as he had only Maria to inherit it, it was really beyond his wants, or even his power to spend, and that he had, ever since Rupert saved Maria from the attempts of Sir Richard Fulk, which, but for him, must have succeeded, regarded him as his adopted son. Rupert saw that his refusal would really give pain, and therefore, with warm gratitude, he accepted the cheque, whose value exceeded that of the united estates of the How and the Chase. Maria brought a magnificent set of jewels for Adele, not indeed that that young lady in any way required them, for the Marquise had had all her mother's jewels, which were superb, reset for the occasion. They were married first at the Roman Catholic chapel at Derby, for Adele was, of course, a Catholic, and then at the church in the village of Winthrop, after which there was a great dinner and much rejoicing and festivity at it. Rupert Holiday went no more to the wars. He obtained leave to reside on his estate for a year. That year, 1710, little was done in Flanders. The Duke's enemies at home had now gained the upper hand, and he was hampered in every way. The Allies saying that a change of government was imminent in England, and that the new party would in all probability make peace at any cost and leave them to themselves. Carried on quiet negotiations with France, and so throughout the summer no great battle took place, although the Allies gained several material advantages. In the following year envy, intrigue, and a woman's spite conquered. Godolphin fell, and the new ministry hastened to make the most disgraceful peace recorded in the annals of the history of this country. By its allies of England were virtually deserted, and the fruits of 10 years of struggle and of victory for the most part abandoned. Marlborough refused to sign the disgraceful peace of Utrecht, and exiled and disgraced lived quietly on the continent until the death of Anne, a living monument of national injustice. When George I ascended the throne, the hero was recalled, and remained the war minister of the country until within a year or two of his death, honored and loved by the people for whom he had done so much. There is little more to tell about Rupert Holiday. His grandfather lived until past 90 years of age, and Madame Holiday died suddenly a few weeks after her father-in-law. Rupert was now one of the largest landowners in the country and was one of the most popular men. The home farm round the Chase was held for generations by the parsons, for Hugh married not many months after his master. At the death of Louise, the Marquise de Pignerolles passed over again to France, and there, at least when England and France were at peace, Colonel Rupert Holiday and his wife paid him long visits. As his daughter had married a foreigner, she could not inherit the estates, which went to a distant relation. But at the death of the Marquise at a good old age, he left a fortune to his daughter, which enabled her husband still further to extend his estates, had Rupert desired it. He could have been raised to the peerage, but he preferred remaining one of the wealthiest private gentlemen in England. From time to time they received visits from Major Dillon and his wife, both of whom were great favourites with the young Holidays. Between Rupert and Hugh, a real affection prevailed all through their lives, and the latter was never so happy as when the children first, and years after the grandchildren of Rupert and Adele came down to the farm to eat cake, drink syllabub, and listen to wonderful tales about the doings of the Cornet of Horse. End of chapter 27. End of The Cornet of Horse by